The morning sun peeked through the curtains as Lynn checked her appearance one last time in the mirror. Her uniform was crisp and clean, a plain gray dress with a white apron that marked her new role as a housekeeper. At 38, she never imagined she'd be starting a job as a maid, especially not after earning her nursing degree years ago. But life had other plans. "Mama, your collar is crooked," her daughter Mai said, reaching up to straighten it. At 15, Mai was growing into a thoughtful young woman, reminding Lynn more and more of her late father each day. Lynn smiled, trying to hide the familiar ache in her chest whenever she thought of her husband. 7 years had passed since the boating accident that took him. The police had never found his body, only his damaged life jacket floating near the overturned boat. The memory still felt fresh, like a wound that refused to heal completely. "I've made you lunch," Mai said, holding up a small container. "Just some fried rice and vegetables. You need to eat properly, Mama." Lynn hugged her daughter tight, fighting back tears. Here she was, supposed to be the caregiver, yet her teenage daughter was looking after her. "What would I do without you?" she whispered. The bus ride to the prestigious Ocean Heights apartment complex was long, giving Lynn time to review the employment details in her mind. The job paid surprisingly well, enough to finally help them move out of their tiny apartment if things worked out. The agency had been clear. Her employer was a prominent businessman who valued discretion and professionalism above all else. The elevator ride to the penthouse made her stomach flutter with nervousness. Floor after floor ticked by until she reached the top level. The doors opened directly into an elegant foyer with marble floors that gleamed like mirrors. Lynn hesitated before stepping out, suddenly very conscious of her worn shoes. A middle-aged woman in a business suit was waiting for her. "You must be the new housekeeper," she said, introducing herself as Mrs. Wong, the property manager. "Mr. Wong is very particular about his space. Everything must be perfect." As they toured the penthouse, Lynn tried to take in all the instructions. Different cleaning products for different surfaces, specific ways to arrange the magazines, precise temperatures for laundry. The list seemed endless. But it was the little details that caught her attention. The way the coffee cups were arranged in the kitchen cabinet, handle angles all perfectly aligned, the specific folding pattern for towels in the bathroom, the particular way books were organized in the study. "Mr. Wong works unusual hours," Mrs. Wong explained, "so you'll rarely see him. That's why everything must be maintained exactly as he likes it. He'll leave notes if he needs anything specific." Lynn nodded, but her mind had drifted to an old memory. Those coffee cups, they were arranged exactly the way her husband used to arrange them, a habit that used to drive her crazy. Even the brand of coffee in the kitchen was the same rare type he used to special order. "Is everything clear?" Mrs. Wong's voice snapped her back to the present. "Yes, absolutely," Lynn replied quickly, pushing away thoughts of the past. She couldn't afford to get lost in memories. This job was her chance to finally get ahead, to give Mai the life she deserved. As Mrs. Wong left, Lynn stood alone in the vast living room, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows with their breathtaking view of the city. 7 years of struggling, of working multiple jobs, of stretching every dollar. Maybe things were finally looking up. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mai. "Good luck, Mama. You'll do great." Lynn smiled, tucking the phone away and reaching for the cleaning supplies. As she began working, a faint scent caught her attention. A familiar cologne that made her pause mid-motion. It was probably just her imagination playing tricks on her, she thought. Grief had a way of doing that, of making you see and smell things that weren't really there. Still, as she moved through the apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this place felt strangely familiar, like walking through a dream where everything is slightly off-kilter. But Lynn pushed these thoughts aside. She had work to do, and dwelling on the past wouldn't help her build a better future for her daughter. The next few weeks passed in a blur as Lynn settled into her new routine at the penthouse. Each morning, she would arrive before sunrise, quietly letting herself in with her keycard. The early hours gave her plenty of time to work undisturbed, though sometimes she caught herself jumping at shadows, still not quite used to being alone in such a huge space. One morning, while dusting the living room shelves, she noticed something odd. The books had been rearranged overnight, but not in the careful way Mr. Wong usually kept them. Instead, they were organized exactly like her late husband had arranged their old bookshelf, novels on top, reference books below, and everything sorted by color rather than author. "You're being silly," she whispered to herself, shaking her head. But her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted a misplaced novel. These little coincidences kept piling up, like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. Later that day, while preparing Mr. Wong's afternoon tea, green tea, 1 cube of sugar, exactly 3 minutes of steeping time, she found herself staring at the tea set. It was the same pattern she and her husband had received as a wedding gift. She'd lost theirs during the move to their smaller apartment after his death. The sound of keys in the door made her jump. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron and stepped back from the counter. Mr. Wong wasn't supposed to be home at this hour. He never was. But instead of her employer, a delivery man appeared with a large package. "Delivery for Mr. Wong," he announced, setting down a box labeled "Premium Coffee Beans." Lynn signed for it, noticing the brand name, the exact same coffee her husband used to special order from a small farm in Vietnam. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mai. "Mama, can you come to my school performance next week? I got a solo in the choir." Lynn smiled, typing back a quick, "Of course." But as she put her phone away, her eyes caught something else. On the coffee table lay a newspaper, folded to show the financial section. Red circles marked certain stocks, a habit her husband had maintained religiously every morning. The cologne scent was stronger today, wafting from the direction of Mr. Wong's study. Lynn had smelled it several times now, always when she cleaned that room. It wasn't just any cologne, it was the specific brand her husband wore, the one she'd given him for their 5th anniversary. As she went about her cleaning duties, more details jumped out at her. The way the remote controls were lined up on the TV stand. How the shoes were arranged in the closet, from formal to casual. Even the brand of toothpaste in the master bathroom. Everything echoed memories of her life with her husband. "Stop it," she told herself firmly. "You're making connections that aren't there." But her hand shook as she straightened a picture frame on the wall. That evening, as she was preparing to leave, she heard muffled voices from the study. Mr. Wong must have come home early. She quickly gathered her things, not wanting to disturb him. But then she heard laughter. A deep, rich laugh that made her freeze in place. It couldn't be. That laugh, it sounded exactly like. The study door opened suddenly, and she caught a glimpse of Mr. Wong on a video call before he quickly ended it. Their eyes met for a brief moment before he turned away, his face unreadable. "Good evening," he said politely, his voice now different, higher, more clipped. "I hope I didn't startle you." "No, sir," Lynn managed to say, her heart pounding. "I was just leaving." As she rode the elevator down, her hands were shaking so badly she could hardly hold her bag. That laugh. She would know that laugh anywhere. But it was impossible. Her husband was dead. She'd mourned him, grieved for him, rebuilt her life without him. Yet as she stepped out into the evening air, Lynn couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Too many coincidences, too many familiar details. Either she was losing her mind, or there was more to Mr. Wong than met the eye. On her bus ride home, she found herself opening her phone's gallery, scrolling back 7 years to the last photo she had of her husband. She studied his smile, his eyes, the way he held himself. Then she thought of Mr. Wong. a completely different man in appearance. And yet, the morning light filtered through the study windows as Lin carefully dusted Mr. Wong's desk. She tried to be quick. This room always made her uneasy, filled with those strange familiar touches that reminded her of her past. But today was different. As she moved a stack of papers, something slipped out and fluttered to the floor. It was a photograph, creased at the corners as if it had been handled often. Lin picked it up, meaning to return it to the pile, but her hand froze mid-motion. The photo showed Mr. Wong at what appeared to be a business conference, dated 5 years ago. He looked different then, his face fuller, his hair styled another way. But it was his smile that caught her attention, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the slight tilt of his head. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, finding that old photo of her husband she'd been studying the night before. The stance, the way he held himself, it was identical. Different face, different build, but the same subtle mannerisms she'd know anywhere. "What are you doing?" Lin spun around, nearly dropping both photos. Mr. Wong stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. She hadn't even heard him come in. "I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, quickly holding out the fallen photograph. "I was just cleaning and this fell." He took the photo, his fingers brushing hers for a moment. They were trembling too, she noticed. A heavy silence filled the room. "The frame on your desk," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "It's from Lee's Antiques on Orchard Road, isn't it?" Mr. Wong's face remained carefully blank. "I wouldn't know. My decorator chose it." "My husband bought me one just like it," Lin continued, her heart pounding. "He said Mr. Lee was the only person who still made frames the old way, with hand-carved details. The shop closed 6 years ago." Something flickered in Mr. Wong's eyes, recognition, fear, but it was gone in an instant. "I have a meeting," he said curtly. "Please finish up here quickly." As he turned to leave, his phone rang. He answered it automatically, and for just a moment, one brief, unguarded moment, his voice changed. "Wei," he said, the familiar Taiwanese accent slipping through before he caught himself and switched back to his usual crisp tones. Lin felt her knees go weak. That "we," it was exactly how her husband used to answer the phone, with that same little lilt at the end. She steadied herself against the desk, her mind spinning. Later that evening, as she waited for her bus home, Lin found herself scrolling through old photos again. But this time, she wasn't looking at faces. She was looking at details. The way her husband stood in photos, the angle of his shoulders when he sat, the way he held his coffee cup. Then she started comparing them with the glimpses she'd caught of Mr. Wong over the past weeks. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mai. "Mama, don't forget to eat dinner. I left dumplings in the fridge." Lin smiled despite her troubled thoughts. Her daughter's care reminded her of why she couldn't just let this go. If there was even a chance. Back home, after Mai had gone to bed, Lin opened her laptop. Her hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she typed. "Facial reconstruction surgery, Singapore." The results made her breath catch. Modern procedures could completely transform a person's appearance. There were before and after photos that seemed impossible. Entirely different people with only their eyes remaining somewhat similar. She clicked through to another article about a businessman who had changed his identity after faking his own death to escape debt. The details were different, but the pattern was similar. Changed appearance, new identity, success in business. Lin closed her laptop, her mind racing. Was she crazy to even consider this possibility? But then she thought about the cologne, the laugh, the way he answered the phone, the identical mannerisms in the photos. Each detail on its own could be coincidence, but all together. She pulled out an old photo album, hidden away in her closet. There in the back was their marriage certificate. Her husband's signature was at the bottom, with its distinctive way of crossing T's. Tomorrow, she decided, She would find a way to see Mr. Wong's signature. Then she would know for sure. As she finally lay down to sleep, Lynn realized her hands had stopped shaking. Whatever the truth was, she was going to find it. Thunder rumbled outside the penthouse windows as Lynn went about her morning duties. The storm matched her unsettled mood. After last night's discovery, every minute in this apartment felt charged with tension. She'd come in early today, hoping to find more clues while cleaning Mr. Wong's study. Her chance came sooner than expected. The intercom buzzed, and through the security camera, she saw a courier with a package requiring a signature. As she signed for it, she noticed Mr. Wong's signature on the existing delivery slip, and her heart nearly stopped. The way the letters slanted, the peculiar loop in the G, it was just like her husband's handwriting, just with a different name. She was still standing there, staring at the signature, when voices echoed from the study. Mr. Wong was on another video call, his door left slightly ajar. Lynn found herself moving closer, drawn by the familiar cadence of his voice when he thought no one was listening. The investment should be finalized by next week, she heard him say, his accent slipping into the comfortable tones she remembered from countless dinner conversations years ago. We just need to. He stopped abruptly as Lynn accidentally bumped a side table, making a vase rattle. Their eyes met through the partially open door. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Mr. Wong quickly switched to his usual formal voice. "I'll call you back," he said into the screen, ending the call. "Is there something you need?" he asked Lynn, but his hands were shaking as he adjusted his tie. "I heard your voice," Lynn said quietly. "Your real voice." "I don't know what you mean," he replied, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. "The way you said investment, that's exactly how my husband used to say it." He could never quite manage the T sound at the end. Always sounded more like investment. A heavy silence filled the room. Outside, the storm grew louder, rain lashing against the windows. "You should go home early today," Mr. Wong said finally. "The weather is getting worse." But Lynn didn't move. "Your signature on the delivery slip," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "The weird loop in the G. My husband used to write exactly the same way. He said his third-grade teacher taught him that style." "Please," he said, and for the first time, his carefully constructed facade cracked slightly. "Don't." "The cologne you wear," Lynn pressed on. "The way you arrange your books. How you answer the phone when you're not thinking about it. The antique frame from Mr. Lee's shop. Your laugh during that video call weeks ago." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating his face. For a split second, beneath the surgical changes, Lynn saw what she'd been looking for, the familiar soul behind the stranger's eyes. "Mai has a choir performance next week," she said softly. "She has a solo. She practices every night in her room, the same room where you used to sing her lullabies." Mr. Wong gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Please, I can't." But then his phone rang again, and as he instinctively reached for it, Lynn darted forward and pressed the answer button before he could stop her. "Why?" The familiar greeting slipped out before he could catch himself. His eyes widened in horror as he realized what he'd done. Lynn reached out and ended the call. 7 years, she said, her voice shaking. 7 years we thought you were dead. May cried herself to sleep for months. I sold everything we had to pay off the debts you left behind. And now you're here, living in luxury, pretending to be someone else. Lynn. It was his real voice now, the one she'd known for 15 years of marriage. "I can explain." "Then explain," she said, pulling out her phone and showing him a photo of Mai at her last birthday. "Explain it to your daughter, who still puts flowers on your empty grave every year. Explain why you let us think you were dead while you became rich." Thunder cracked again, and in that moment, looking at his face, Lynn finally knew for certain. The man she'd been working for, this wealthy stranger in his luxury penthouse, was her husband, and now he had nowhere left to hide. The rain continued to pour outside as Lin and Mr. Wong sat facing each other in his study. The silence between them felt heavier than the storm clouds outside. "I never meant," he began, then stopped, running his hands through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made Lin's heart ache. "I never meant for it to go on this long." "But it did," Lin said quietly. 7 years. You've been alive all this time, watching us struggle, watching us mourn." He reached for a drawer in his desk, pulled out a thick folder. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Lin gasped as she saw what they were. Mai at school events, Lin at her various jobs, their small apartment building. He'd been watching them all along. "The loan sharks," he finally said, his carefully constructed accent slipping away completely. "They weren't just going to take money. They threatened you and May. I heard them planning. I couldn't let them hurt you. So you abandoned us instead." Lin's voice cracked. "Left us with nothing." "I left you the insurance money," he protested weakly, "which barely covered your gambling debts." Lin stood up, her hands shaking. "We lost our home. I had to work 3 jobs. Mai had to change schools." He flinched at each statement, the expensive suit and transformed face unable to hide his shame. "I was weak then," he said. "I was a coward. But after I died, I promised myself I would fix everything. By becoming rich, by hiding behind a new face." He stood up, moved to the window. Lightning flashed, illuminating his profile. "I went to Vietnam first," he said quietly. "Worked on the coffee farms where I used to import from. Learned the business from the ground up. Made connections. Then Thailand, investment opportunities. I built something real this time, not like my gambling days." And the new face. He touched his chin self-consciously. 3 years ago. The best surgeon in Seoul. I knew I'd come back someday, but I needed to be unrecognizable. The loan sharks still have people here. Were they worth it? Lin asked, holding up the photos of Mai. "All these moments you missed. Her first dance recital, her winning the science competition, the night she cried for hours because she couldn't remember the sound of your voice anymore." He crumpled into his chair, and for the first time, Lin saw beyond her anger to the weight of guilt he'd been carrying. But it didn't make it hurt any less. "I sent money," he whispered. "Anonymous deposits to your account. Paid for Mi's school fees through a foundation. I tried to take care of you from a distance. We didn't need your money." Lin's voice rose. "We needed you. Do you know what it's like to tell your child her father is never coming home? To watch her grow up wondering if she did something wrong to make you leave." A photo slipped from the folder. Mi's latest school picture. He picked it up with trembling hands. "She looks so much like you now," he said softly. "She's getting her academic award next month," Lin said. "She worked so hard for it. Will you watch that from a distance too? Take another secret photo to add to your collection." He looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "What do you want me to do?" "I'd want." Lin had to steady herself against the desk. "I want you to explain to our daughter why her father chose to disappear instead of facing his problems. I want you to look her in the eye and tell her why you let her believe you were dead for 7 years." Thunder crashed outside, making them both jump. In that moment, Lin saw him clearly, not the successful Mr. Wong, not even her husband from 7 years ago, but a man torn between his past and present, crushed under the weight of his choices. "She deserves to know the truth," Lin said finally. "No more hiding. No more secrets. She's old enough now." He nodded slowly, defeat and relief mingling on his surgically altered face. "When?" Lin looked at her watch. "Her choir practice ends in an hour. I'm picking her up." She stood, straightening her uniform out of habit. "You can come with me. if you're finally ready to stop hiding. The storm outside began to ease, but inside that study, the real storm was just beginning. The drive to Mi's school was silent. Lin sat in the passenger seat of Mr. Wong's luxury car, stealing glances at the man she'd once known better than herself. Despite his changed appearance, she could now see traces of her husband in every movement. The way he gripped the steering wheel, how he checked his mirrors, even how he sat. "She might hate me," he said finally, his voice barely audible over the car's engine. "She might," Lin agreed. "I'm not sure I don't hate you myself right now." They pulled into the school parking lot just as students began streaming out of the building. Lin spotted Mai immediately, her backpack slung over one shoulder, laughing with her friends. "She always laughs like that," he whispered, "just like when she was little." "Wait here," Lin said firmly. "Let me talk to her first." Mi's smile faded when she saw her mother's serious expression. "Mama, what's wrong? Why aren't you at work?" Lin took her daughter's hands in hers. "Mai, something has happened. Something that's going to be very hard to understand." "You're scaring me," Mai said. "Are you sick?" No. Lin squeezed her hands. "It's about your father." Mai stiffened. They rarely spoke about him directly. "What about him?" Lin took a deep breath. "He's alive, Mai. He didn't die in that accident." Mai yanked her hands away. "That's not funny, Mama. Why would you say something like that?" "Because it's true." Lin gestured toward the car. "He's here." Mai turned, her eyes widening as Mr. Wong stepped out of the car. "I don't understand," she said. "That's your boss, the man you work for." "No," Lin said gently. "Look at how he stands. Look at his expressions. Remove the changes to his face in your mind." Mai stared, her breathing getting faster. "No," she whispered. "No, it can't be." He walked toward them slowly, like someone approaching a frightened animal. When he spoke, he used his real voice, the one Mai hadn't heard in 7 years. "Hello, little butterfly," he said softly, using his old nickname for her. Mi's knees buckled. Lin caught her before she could fall. "That voice," Mai gasped. "But your face." "Surgery," he explained. "I had to change everything about my appearance. But it's me, Mai. It's really me." 7 years, Mai said, her voice rising. 7 years you let us think you were dead. Do you know how many nights I cried for you? How many times I needed my father?" Students were staring now. Lin gently guided them toward the car. "Let's go somewhere private." They drove to a small park where Mai used to play as a child. The same park where he had taught her to ride a bike. They sat at a wooden table, Mai as far from him as possible. "The loan sharks," he began explaining. "They were going to hurt you both. I had to disappear to protect you." "Protect us?" Mi's laugh was bitter. "Do you know what really hurt us? Thinking you were dead. Watching Mama work herself sick to pay off your debts. Having to move schools because we couldn't afford our old apartment." "I sent money," he said weakly. "We didn't want your money," Mai shouted, tears streaming down her face. "We wanted you. I wanted my father." "I know," he whispered. "I know now that I was wrong. That I made everything worse by running away." "Did you ever think about us?" Mai asked. "Really think about what you were doing to us?" He pulled out the folder of photos. "Every day. I watched you grow up from a distance. Every achievement, every milestone." "Like a stranger," Mai said. "Like a creepy stranger taking photos of a family that wasn't his anymore." His hands trembled as he closed the folder. "You're right. I gave up the right to be your father 7 years ago." "Yes," Mai said, standing up. "You did." "Mai," Lin started, but her daughter cut her off. "I need time," Mai said. I can't process this right now. I want to go home." They all stood, 3 people bound by blood and tears, now strangers to each other. As they walked back to the car, he tried one last time. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he said. "But please, please let me try to make things right." Mai turned to him, her eyes full of 7 years of pain. "You can start," she said, "by explaining to the police why you faked your own death." The next few days passed in a blur of police statements and legal meetings. Mr. Wong, or rather, Lin's long-lost husband, had turned himself in, confessing everything. The news spread quickly through their community, turning their private pain into public spectacle. Mai hadn't spoken more than a few words since that day in the park. She stayed in her room, skipped her choir practice, and barely touched her food. Lin would often find her staring at old family photos, tracing her father's face with her finger. One morning, while Lin was making breakfast, Mai finally broke her silence. "I found these," she said, placing a stack of bank statements on the kitchen table. "All the anonymous deposits you never told me about. They were from him, weren't they?" Lin nodded slowly. "I didn't know at the time. I thought they were from some government support program." "Did that money make you feel better?" Mai asked, her voice sharp. "Did it make up for him abandoning us?" "No," Lin said quietly. "Money never fixes the important things." The doorbell rang, interrupting them. It was their lawyer, a kind-faced woman who had taken their case pro bono after hearing their story. "The prosecutor has made a decision," she explained, settling at their small kitchen table. "Given the circumstances, the threats against your family, the full confession, and his willingness to make amends, they're offering a plea deal. No jail time, but hefty fines and community service. He gets to walk free." Mi's voice cracked. "After everything he did." "The law sees this differently than we do," the lawyer explained gently. "Technically, he committed fraud to protect his family from credible threats. His actions since then, building a legitimate business, secretly supporting you, work in his favor." Lin watched her daughter's hands ball into fists. "What about our pain? Doesn't that count for anything?" "The court can't prosecute someone for breaking hearts," the lawyer said softly. "That's between you and him." Later that evening, as Lin was folding laundry, she found one of May's old stuffed animals, a butterfly plush toy her father had given her. The wings were worn thin from years of tearful hugging. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from him, using his real name for the first time in 7 years. "The doctors recommended family counseling. If you're willing, both of you." Lin stared at the message for a long time before showing it to Mai. Her daughter read it twice, then curled up on the couch, hugging the butterfly toy she'd spotted in the laundry basket. "I keep thinking," Mai said finally, "about all those times I wished for a miracle. All those birthdays when I blew out my candles and wished he would come back." She wiped her eyes. "But not like this. Never like this." The next day, they met with the counselor, a gentle woman who specialized in family trauma. They sat in her cozy office, Mi as far from her father as possible, Lin somewhere in between. "This will take time," the counselor explained. "There's no quick fix for 7 years of grief and betrayal. But if you're all willing to do the work—" "I'll do anything," he said quickly. "Whatever it takes." Mi's laugh was hollow. "That's what you said before. About the gambling. About the debts. You always say what you think people want to hear." "You're right," he admitted. "I was weak. I made promises I couldn't keep. But losing you, watching you grow up from a distance, seeing your pain, it changed me." "How do we know?" Lin asked. "How can we ever trust you again?" The counselor leaned forward. "Trust isn't given. It's earned, slowly, through consistent actions over time. Are you all willing to try, to take those first small steps?" They looked at each other, 3 wounded people connected by love and pain, by mistakes and consequences, by a past they couldn't change and a future they weren't sure how to build. Finally, Mai spoke, her voice small but steady. "I'm not ready to forgive you," she said to her father. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready. But," she glanced at the butterfly toy she'd brought with her, "I'm willing to try the counseling." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But as they left the counselor's office that day, walking together yet apart, it was something they hadn't had in 7 years. A beginning. 6 months had passed since the truth came out. The leaves were turning golden in the park where they now met each Sunday. Neutral ground, the counselor had called it. Lynn watched as Mai practiced her choir music on a bench nearby, while her father sat at a respectful distance, listening. The weekly family therapy sessions had slowly begun to help. They'd learned to talk about the hard things, the anger, the betrayal, the fear. Mai had finally asked the question that had haunted her for 7 years. Did you ever really love us? The answer had come with tears and trembling hands, as he showed them something he'd carried all these years. A worn family photo, creased and faded, that had traveled with him from Vietnam to Thailand, through his transformation into Mr. Wong, and finally back home. Today was different, though. Today was Mi's big performance, her first solo with the school choir. She'd almost quit after everything came out, but her music teacher had convinced her to stay. The song, her father said quietly, breaking the Sunday morning silence, "It was your mother's favorite lullaby for you." Mai paused in her practice. "You remember?" "Every word," he said. "You wouldn't sleep unless we both sang it." A small smile flickered across Mi's face. Rare, precious, like a butterfly landing briefly before taking flight again. Lynn checked her watch. "We should go. The performance starts in an hour." They drove separately, another boundary they were still keeping. At the school auditorium, he sat in the back while Lynn took her place in the front row. Some wounds were still too fresh for closer contact. The choir filed onto the stage, Mi in her black and white uniform. When she stepped forward for her solo, Lynn held her breath. The familiar melody filled the air, the same lullaby they'd been talking about in the park. Mi's voice soared, clear and strong, singing about hope and healing, about finding light in darkness. Lynn felt tears on her cheeks. Behind her, she knew he was crying too. After the performance, they gathered in the school garden. May clutched her music certificate, looking uncertain. "You were wonderful," he said softly. "I changed some of the words," Mai admitted. "Made them about finding your way back home, about forgiveness." It was the first time she'd used that word, forgiveness. It hung in the air between them, delicate as a soap bubble. "I have something to show you both," he said, pulling out some papers. "I've signed the penthouse over to you, Lynn, and set up a trust for May's education. We don't want—" Lynn began, but he cut her off gently. "I know. It's not about the money, but I need to do this. Not to buy forgiveness, but to give you both the security I should have provided all along." Mai studied the papers. "What about you?" "I've rented a small apartment nearby. Close enough if you ever want to talk. Far enough to give you space." Lynn noticed he also legally changed his name back. No more Mr. Wong. He was reclaiming his real identity, step by small step. "I got accepted to the National Youth Choir," Mai said suddenly. "The competition is next month." "That's wonderful," he said, then added carefully, "I'd like to come. If that's okay." Mai nodded slowly. Middle row. Not too close, not too far. It wasn't perfect. There were still days when Mai couldn't look at him, when Lynn's anger bubbled up fresh and hot, when the weight of 7 lost years felt too heavy to bear. But there were also moments, small, precious moments, when healing seemed possible. As they walked to their separate cars, Mai turned suddenly and hugged her father. It was brief, awkward, but real. Lynn saw him freeze, then gently pat Mi's back, as if afraid she might break or disappear. "See you next Sunday," Mai said, stepping back. "At the park." He nodded, unable to speak. Later that night, as Lynn was locking up, she found a butterfly toy on their doorstep. Not the old worn one, but a new one. Attached was a note, for new beginnings. She placed it on Me's bed, next to the old one. Old and new, past and present, pain and healing. All part of their story now. Not a perfect ending, but a real one. A family finding their way back to each other, one small step at a time.